My name is Michelle Ubaraga. I serve as the Executive Director for the Park County Environmental Council. We are your community conservation group. We work here with people in Park County to safeguard the land, water, wildlife, and communities right here in Yellowstone's Northern Gateway. We do that through grassroots organizing and advocacy. We've been hosting these Zoom conversations with our community about growth and planning over the past several years. Of course, we've moved online to the Zoom world, and so we're recording these presentations. They're available on our website. We're live on Facebook, and you can always go to pcecmt.org to look to the archived events and to see what's coming up. Our goal is to host a conversation that helps us learn and gain a shared understanding of some of the most pressing conservation issues we face as a community so that we collectively can be more knowledgeable and prepared to advocate for this place. There's a lot happening right now in our community. We've been seeing more and more people retreating to gateway communities like ours to live near natural amenities, public lands, the Yellowstone River, and Yellowstone National Park. And this trend has been happening for years. And with the COVID pandemic, the increase in new residents in our community and here in Southwest Montana is quite remarkable. And so growth at the current rate can lead to a lot of problems traditionally thought of as big city problems like lack of affordable housing, congestion, income inequality, not to mention the impacts on wildlife habitat and impacts to our water resources that are all threatened from the ever expanding human footprint. So now more than ever, it's really imperative that we work together at the local level and set out a vision for how we want to grow, identify the problems, and work together to maintain our unique quality of life that in a way that doesn't overly burden taxpayers or our natural resources. So we're very excited to focus this conversation on the Yellowstone River and our work with the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group, which Max leads for PCEC. Before I introduce Max, I want to thank everyone that has been showing up to these meetings and to last week's planning board meetings. There were some really important conversations happening around growth in Livingston and the maps. I appreciate that everyone stuck it out and made comments, even though the format was a bit awkward. So thank you for everyone who's been participating in those conversations. I think that as we continue to participate, it'll get smoother. The next planning board meeting is February 3rd. So mark your calendars for that. Okay, so I'm going to pass it over to Max. Max Yortzberg grew up in Paradise Valley and worked in water resources as a private consultant before coming to PCEC in 2016. That summer was the summer the fish kill closed the Yellowstone River, and Max had his hands full as he helped launch PCEC's Yellowstone Headwaters program and worked along community members, including our guests today, to support and strengthen the community conservation efforts of the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group. That group is a rough and tumble crew of locals that care deeply about our river, that are working together, rolling up their sleeves, to do good community level work that we need to do to safeguard one of our most precious, beloved resources, the Yellowstone River. So with that, I will pass it over to Max to introduce our speakers and look forward to an excellent presentation. Thank you, Max, Whitney, and Jeff, and everybody for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. As Michelle mentioned, my name is Max Yortzberg. I am the Conservation Director for PCEC, and I've worked in various roles in the water resource field for nearly 20 years now. And it's something I care deeply about, and it's an area of PCEC's program work that I devote much of my energy and time towards. So we're here today to talk about the Yellowstone River, but we also, there's also the Shields River and their many tributaries. And in my opinion, our water resources are one of our greatest resources that this area has to offer. I mean, from drinking water to irrigation to fishing and recreation, this is something we all have a stake in. And yes, the fish kill in 2016 was a grim reminder of just how vulnerable that resource can be, and also a reminder of how central it is to all of our lives. The health of our community and the health of this ecosystem are inextricably linked in many ways. So the river recreation survey work that we're here to talk about today, was born out of that summer of PKD in many ways. It served as a wake-up call. The Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group was reinvigorated that year when, local stakeholders got together within that group to start addressing the issue of PKD and many others. And there was a river symposium held shortly after in 2017, and many of the participants were polled on issues of importance at that meeting, and river use and recreation was one of those issues that rose to the forefront. And we only had to take, a quick look at what's been going on over on the Madison River to understand why. And in fact, with regard to the Madison, we did have a meeting. The Watershed Group had a meeting with Travis Horton and others from FWP to talk about what they were doing on the Madison and also what could be done on the Yellowstone. And they, they basically said they were aware that use on the Yellowstone was increasing, but they didn't have any data. And so the Watershed Group really decided then that, we need to figure out how we're going to get this data and start working on this and looking at this issue and kind of just take the reins and not wait for the time when FWP would necessarily be ready to start, since they did have their hands full on the Madison. So, this is really a, community effort, and it speaks to the energy and passion that our community has for the river. And so just kind of anecdotally, when I was out last summer helping with this project, it was the first time I'd actually gone to a fishing access site when I didn't try to get the hell out of there as fast as I could, either to hike up the bank and go fishing or to get in a boat and start floating. And, I gained a new perspective. Aside from the great people watching that the survey work provided, I was, even watching the river and being on the river, I was really amazed at how busy it can get on a Sunday afternoon in July. I saw, but, what I really also noticed was just how happy people were on the river, and, maybe beer helped with that. I don't know. But really more than ever, and I think especially during the trying times that we've been through under the cloud of COVID, the river was an escape for many people. And spending time on the river is always a welcome respite for everyone, myself included. And as we see this area grow in popularity and grow in population, I don't think we can take it for granted anymore. If we want to keep our collective experience of river time a positive one, then we have to increase our knowledge and understanding of how and where and when we use the river. Since I think we all have a pretty good idea of why we get out on the river. And this recreation survey was a step in that direction. So there were a lot of people involved. Just want to acknowledge some of them. I'd like to thank Ashley Lowry, the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group's fearless coordinator. She does a fantastic job holding a disparate group of people together. I'd also like to thank the folks at Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks who pivoted resources and personnel last summer to work with us on this project. A big thanks to Norman Nickerson, who works with the Institute for Tourism and Recreation Research out of the University of Montana. She brought her expertise in social sciences to this project. And also I'd like to thank all my colleagues here at PCEC and our high school interns last summer who lent a hand both behind the scenes and on the ground doing field work. And a big thanks to a handful of folks who volunteered their time to help us out when they could. And just on a quick note, we're going to be doing this again this year. So if anyone on this call is interested in helping, volunteering, please reach out to us. Just email me directly or sign up our volunteer sign up sheet on PCEC's website, or contact the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group through their website. I'll put those links and that info in the chat window for us. So if you're interested in this, let us know. We can always use more help and support from our community on this. And that's kind of the goal of this presentation is to to get some feedback and to generate a discussion, so we can maybe learn more and maybe see if there are any new angles that we haven't actually caught on to yet. So we'll get to that at the end. But now I'd like to introduce our guest speakers. Jeff Reed is an entrepreneur who works at Reed Fly Farm in Paradise Valley. Whitney Tilt is the director of conservation benchmarks over in Bozeman. I've had the pleasure of working with Jeff and Whitney in the Upper Yellowstone Watershed group now for several years. And I have to say these two individuals were instrumental in pulling off this project last year during the middle of a pandemic. Even when we all naively thought that maybe 2020 was going to be a down year because of it, they've been very generous in giving their time to the Watershed group and to this project, while also having to hold down their respective jobs and carrying on with their personal lives. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff and Whitney. Thank you all.
Thanks, Max.
Thank you, Max.
Take it away, Jeff. Or am I starting? Well, I'm going to start. Believe it or not, we have an agenda here. We're going to fly through this stuff. Many of you have seen some of this. Many of you have been involved in it. I would add to Max's kudos, both the incredible support we got from private landowners allowing us on their land for both cameras and observation work. And the major funding for this was from A&B West, for much of it for a workshop we were unable to hold. But I really appreciate their flexibility that we could turn that into some cameras and a little bit gas money. And that's what got this underway. So quick overview on the methodology and some of our preliminary data. And then we really want to get into some of the summary information and looking at who's on this call. There's a lot of talent here, so it's really important we get to hear from you. So we're going to tease you up to the top water, and then we'll see where we go from there. And next, Jeff. Obviously, as Max and Michelle pointed out, really important from the day one, this project has been from the ground up. It is not being driven by any threat of regulation. We have no interest even in the pictures we've taken of someone doing bad things or something their spouse might not like them be seen doing. It is simply to gather use data and frame questions and future directions that we might want to take. So it's really important, and this is why PCEC is such an important partner here. You know, what are the things coming up? How do we address it? I will say that from my standpoint, flying my "Don't Tread on Me" flag, there is nothing here that's talking about future regulations. It's what's the community want to see happen and how might we do that from inside the community. So with that commercial done, I might point out that this slide points out the fact that many of our cameras made great bird watching areas. And so any object that was placed in front of our cameras attracted the bird life. And next, Jeff. So the methodology was really framed in what we knew from, I did a survey on looking at what else had been done by other states and in other areas. We had the involvement of ITRR and FWP to help us design intercept surveys. That's where we talk to people at the put in takeout spots. We did utilize cameras, but it came very apparent very quickly that we needed to somehow to try to judge a snapshot of how many vessels and all were on the river. We didn't have the bandwidth of that, so we did something called a sweep survey, and we'll get into a little bit more data on that. But those were essentially the components of the project that we utilized. We learned a lot, and I will say that this has been very unique, both in the way it's been from the ground up and from some of the methodology used. Next, Jeff. So I'm looking at people like Dan Vermillion and all, who obviously know the river incredibly well. But if we start at Gardner and end up at Mayor's Landing, there are a lot of access points. There's no doubt that for the Paradise Valley, the river is the way you get outdoors. While we have tons of trails and all that, our access to the river is really remarkable in this stretch. And as you can see here, a lot of fish access sites managed by many different, or not many, but mostly managed by FWP, but also by the Forest Service, Bureau of Reclamation, and Park County / City of Livingston. So all of them came from different kind of ontogenies. Of course, many, if not most, all supported by sportsmen's dollars and the excise tax, but also LWCF. So this is an incredible legacy. And they each have their own character. And so we basically focused on in differing amounts of attention from Gardner to Mayor's Landing for this study. Next. So the first piece was the intercept data, where we designed a survey. FWP gave us a full-time seasonal who actually administered most of the surveys. This is face-to-face. We also had some of our volunteers do it, but where they engaged the people, whether they're taking out or transiting. And you see here some of the respondents. So over 1,000 people were interviewed. And they were asked about why were they there, how many times they've been there. There's a great deal of information here, of which we're only just scratching the very surface. But on the left, you'll see some bar charts. And basically, the blue is people who are highly satisfied with their outing, and the red is a few that weren't. Now, this could be seen as a motherhood question. Oh, well, we had a great time. But the fact is, these people were simply asked, how was their adventure? And they went so far as to say, it's great. It's not okay, it was great. So that emphasizes that as much as other things might be going on in our life, especially in a pandemic year, when you get a chance to get out on the water, you enjoy yourself. The people who didn't like it, gee, it was cold, they got wet. There were things that really were a personal response, not so much that the ramps were so crowded we couldn't get there, etc. So again, this bodes well for the experience, but those of us who are lucky enough to live around here kind of already get that. So next slide, please. Oh, I should point, but you don't need to go back, but we did center most of our activity on the intercept from Immigrant downriver to Mayors. And so you can see, that's obviously where most of the people are, but that's also where our concentration on the intercept was aimed at. Next. So again, if we look at on the left, it's probably a little, I don't know how well you can see it, but the stack bar here basically is 61% of the people that were at the fish access sites were there for water-based recreation, and the remainder were there for shore-based. Because this included Mayor's Landing, dog walking and things like that, fishing from shore, swimming, just getting outdoors would have been the shore-based, and on water is they were getting into a vessel. And then were they satisfied at not? Again, a very high number of people just wanting to be out on the water, time spent with family and friends, having some fishing time, just taking in some solitude, learning a new skill, and a few even thought it beat work. So again, the full report is available. Max, you may want to put it up on PCEC's website, but it is up on the Upper Yellowstone Watershed's website. And again, this was driven by Norman Nickerson and Institute for Recreation and Recreational Research, Tourism and Recreational Research over at University of Montana. Next, please.
Whitney, why don't you briefly cover the on-water breakdown of the three classes, just so people are aware.
Well, we'll see it in a bit, but it's, you know, largely the breakdown here, the light blue on the top is fishing guided. The next one down is, I've got it split on my screen. So is
here, you don't have your glasses on, do you? You need to put your glasses on. The breakdown from top to bottom is fishing guided, and then underneath that in light blue is fishing private, and then below that is boating but non-fishing. So of the 60% of the people who are going out on the water at an access point, half of those were doing non-fishing boating experiences. The other half is broken down into roughly 10% doing a guided fishing experience and the remainder doing a private fishing experience.
You did that very well, Jeff, but you have your glasses on. Okay, so the part that I talked about that was kind of innovative for us was this idea of trying to get a snapshot of who's on the river what. And obviously, by and large, with the exception of maybe Mayor's Landing, no one walks to a fish access site. They're going to drive. So the thought was we would do a sweep from Gardner to Carter's, counting all the trailers and vehicles in each of the access points. And that would give us a kind of snapshot of use on the river. And so we'll get into some of those details there, but we would start at McConnell's up downstream of Gardner, and basically did this 28 times during the summer, where you just pop in and count every single vehicle and trailer that you saw. We counted trailers and vehicles, because obviously the trailers would give us a little bit of an idea of who's launching vehicle or vessels, although again, they could be launching from the back of their pickup truck. So we're not sure this has been used anywhere else, but we found it a very good way to make ourselves a lot larger than we were. With very limited manpower and a small budget, this gave us that snapshot. So as well as being able, and I did most of them, it also gave us an idea to look at how the sites were being used, how much crowding, the actual status of each of the facilities. And so we have a great deal of information on these individual sites, and that will be very much part of our research. We'll be working with the community to make recommendations on each of these sites and where they might go from here. All right, Jeff.
Okay, well, let's go through some of this data. One of our goals was not only just to go get data, but to present it in a way that is meaningful to the general public. So here's one way to do that. We've come up with multiple ways, but one way is simply to present the top 5 vehicle or trailer days on the entire stretch. And like Whitney mentioned, the benefit of this sweep data is to understand the entire stretch of the 60 miles of the river at one point in time, right? Instead of just being at one fishing access site and doing a survey, looking at the whole thing. There are plenty of great ArcGIS maps across the country where researchers do this with traffic data on actual roads and really understand how traffic is flowing. There is very little of that going on rivers. And so we're trying to move in that direction. And here were the top 5 vehicle days. So Carter's is a common one. And on August 22nd, it had 92 vehicles parked there with 46 trailers. Mallard's next at 90 on September 5th. Carter's again on August 29th with 88. Immigrant then shows up on July 12th with 78. And then the 5th most busy day at a site was immigrant with 72 on the 15th. Another way to look at this is over time. So this graph here, on the top half of the section is the count of the number of vehicles at fishing access sites, the color codes at the top, and then the total number of vehicles for a given day. So it's just a stacked bar chart. In this first reading here, it shows you that there were over roughly 400 vehicles along the entire Upper Yellowstone on that given day. That given day was, I think it was July 8th. And then the same sort of reading over the entire summer until we quit doing this in late September. So you can see the busiest days, and then you can also get a gauge for which are the busiest sites just by the volume that they take up on this chart. And then below it, on the lower half, is the number of trailers. So roughly it's half of those cars on that first day had trailers associated with them. And remember, this is at a point in time in the day. So this doesn't tell you everything, but it really is helpful for seeing across the entire river at a point in time in the day, what was the rough number of traffic at the fishing access sites, and therefore most likely on the river. So this is one way to visualize this data. And like Whitney said, there's a URL there where you can go and see this data for yourself, as well as download the report. Another way to visualize it is this graphic. In the top left, this is basically showing you the busiest days. So in the top left is the busiest day, going from top down to the right. In the bottom right is the least busy day of the season. And then within each square or rectangle, color-coded square, it shows you the busiest site going from top left to bottom right. So here on August 29th, Carter's was the busiest, then Mallard's, then Pine Creek, then Gray Owl, Immigrant, Myers, Lochleven, Carbella, and on the way down. So it's a good way to see not only the day, but the sites over the entire summer season. You learn a few things when you start looking at this, anomalies that you may not have never known. You also see over here, for example, on August 5th, I believe this was the first time, no, August 7th was the first time Immigrant actually jumped ahead of Carter's and Mallard's as the busiest day. And once you dig into the data, you start seeing the trends of why weekdays are possibly busier in the middle section of the river rather than down closer to Livingston. And then ultimately, you know, if you really wanted to know what was going on the river 24/7, you would have to have humans sitting there all the time, you know, filling out a piece of paper, logging it, and submitting it. And of course, we don't have that money nor time. And so one substitute are game trail cameras. And you can then get a 24/7 snapshot of the entire stretch of the river. And here on the right, you see some of the photos that were collected that just give you a sense for the different types of river users, different types of vessels you see on the river. And again, our goal was not surveillance here. It was to count the types of vehicles or vessels that were on the river and when they were using it. We put cameras out on some private property at Point of Rocks, at Dan Bailey's and at Pine Creek's area, or I mean the stretches from Point of Rocks to Immigrant, Dan Bailey to Lochleven, and Pine Creek to Carter. So trying to capture the three different zones of the river. The problem with cameras is they're not meant for river traffic, right? They're meant for animals walking by or people walking by. So the best way to use them is to put them in a time-lapse mode and just take snapshots over time. The problem with that is you end up with 210,000 images collected at those 4 locations, which I happily went through one by one and then tallied up the number of boats. But it is you know, you learn a lot by doing it. it is very difficult to count commercial versus private boats because there is no strict way that would help you differentiate, even with the tags that are supposed to be on boats, to see them all the time, or they might be turned at a certain angle and so you can't see them in the game trail camera. So this is not a way to definitively learn about the difference between private boats using the river and commercially guided boats using the river, but it does give you a really good sense over 24/7 when people are using the river in different vessels. An obvious lesson you learn is from these sorts of charts that we displaying here is that when it gets warmer in the day, more people are using the river. People don't get up at 6 a.m. in the morning to float the river with their kids. At least most people don't, right? But you'll certainly have outfitters out earlier in the morning. And then you'll see traffic pick up with locals or just tourists coming in and rafting the river and whatnot. So we captured all of that data, and that's the benefit of using these game trail cameras and then doing the counts. And then you also can get a really good sense of, if you were a deer standing on the side of the river all day long, what would you see? Like, how does that flow? And we took one of those days and turned it into a time-lapse video, just so you can get a sense of the ebb and flow of traffic going down the river in a given day. One of these places was near Nelson Spring Creek. And what's nice is we can correlate the data of our counts at the fishing access sites to what floated by on the actual river. And so you can see here the fishing access site counts at Pine Creek, Mallards, and Carters, which is generally where these vehicles and boats would get in and get out. And then the camera data, there were over 5,000 images. The first recreational use was at 11:37 in the morning that floated by. The last recreational use was at 8:27, 8 p.m. You can see deer swimming across the river in the cameras, all sorts of things. This was one where, I'm just using my judgment as someone who, sees a lot of boats on the river and doing my best to count the number of fishing boats versus non-fishing boats. You can't always count that because someone might put a rod in the corner of their boat, but you get a general sense of the difference between a boat that people are actively fishing in versus non-fishing in. And that came down to 23 fishing boats and 107 non-fishing boats. And then the number of people represented in those types of boats.
Jeff,
and then the estimated.
Could I just,
go ahead.
I noticed there's several questions about the temperature. Can you go back one slide quickly? So one of the interesting things, someone asked, obviously the cameras register the temperature, and I'd say they're very accurate in the morning and the evening, but many of them are exposed to the sun. So is 108 degrees an accurate temperature? Actually, if you're sitting in a boat, it's a damn accurate because you're having the sun beat on your head just like the camera is, but you do sense and you see them here. So the one on the left is giving you a sense of the number of boats actively fishing. That's the yellow line. And then you're getting the type of use. And on the other one, you're getting the air temperature. So you can really, the important thing to know when you're looking at the sweep data and this data is beginning at Father's Day or so this coming year, we're going to start taking this kind of data and make it consistently applied throughout the season. So right now you're just looking at snapshots, but then we're going to take what we've learned and really be able to give an ebb and flow. So I do think the camera temperatures are, obviously they're exposed to the sun in many cases, but they are probably pretty accurate to what someone on the water is feeling. Back to you, Jeff.
Yeah, it's a good point. There's lots of things in the Q&A you can ask, like the Yellowstone's a free-flowing river. So if it's muddy, you're going to see differences in traffic. And we captured that data. We haven't really visually captured that data yet for you. So the last thing here was roughly about 5% of the traffic is what we were seeing could be reasonably identified as guided fishing in this stretch of the river. That dynamic changes as you move up the river. And there you can see the first boat and the last boat of the day. And you can kind of tell by just, it's getting dark. In the next phase, we're working on some AI cameras, these modern cameras that you use for your Ring doorbell or your Nest at your home to look for people breaking into your house, that can automatically count boats. And here you see on the right some of these game trail cameras we trialed, and they literally know if there's a boat on the river, and then they actually know how many people are on that boat and do those sorts of counts. And with that sort of information, you can really get a much more accurate ebb and flow of usage over time without a lot of expense. And with that, I'll kind of give it back to Whitney to summarize the year. We got a couple more slides and then we'll go to Q&A.
Great. Well, as many of you know, early on in 2020, it looked like for many of the outfitters and river-related businesses that it was going to be an absolute, death knell. And in fact, by the end of the season, many of our businesses, and we saw this throughout the fly fishing industry, certainly, had record years. So people did get out in numbers that we, talking to most of you and all, you'd say that there were more people out in 2020 than you saw in previous years. So the river experience, we thought originally that COVID would really whack everything apart, but we think if anything, it's was indicative of maybe what we're going to continue to see as far as intensive use. And there are a lot of learnings that many of you on this call already know. Like if you want to show up at Gray Owl at 11:30 in the morning on a Sunday, you better stand in line. And so we saw, we are, as you can see from this data, we're able to start correlating numbers, type of use, where, when, and how it correlates to everything from weather to water temperatures. We also obviously do have the water temperatures because those are registered in the flow meters. So now we really want to get into what's all this mean. So as we look at the proposed activities for the coming year, we want to start earlier and extend through September. That obviously is somewhat scope and funding related, but we're fairly confident that we'll get the funding and staffing we need. This is still remains a very lean research project. We plan to, one of the things that you did notice, for those of you who are very observant, there was not much activity recorded on the upper river from Gardner, say, down to Carbella. We did reach out and talk to the commercial rafting companies. We do plan to extend cameras up there so we can get a sense of use, levels of use, and nature of use. So we'll take what we hope are these next gen cameras and deploy them really from Gardner down to at least Mayors, and there's a lot of interest in perhaps going at least one or two stretches below that. We have initiated discussions with landowners. We didn't really get into some of the landowner experiences with all this great use of the river. They were not necessarily all fun. There was more trespass, more fire danger, more of a lot of things. And that will be where I think PCEC and others will really look, how do we get a better educated user, respectful of private lands, but still having a great time on the water. So best practices from other river systems will be brought into this, developing scenarios for better outreach and etiquette, adopting these fish access sites by the community so that they're really ours, that it's not just a list of a few things which you can't do, but you're really being introduced to the river as something you should take credit for. We are looking at improved reporting with the outfitters to see if there's a better way, both to make it easier for them in their reporting, as Dan and others on this phone know. The outfitters are put through the ringer for reporting, and that reporting is really of very little use to anybody. So we're looking at some of those things doing a little bit of impacts analysis, and really look to roll this up into a series of potential scenarios that we would then work with you all and the rest of the community to figure out which ones are the most important. So with that, what else do we have, Jeff?
Let's just Q&A.
Oh, there's the riparian. But so now we really want to open it up to you all for comments both on the data and how we did it, and anything that is, you know, top of mind for you all.
Yeah, and if people want to just unmute and ask their question, that's fine. Or if you want to feel better typing it in the chat box, we'll address it there. I see Pat Byerth, you had a question in the chat box. I don't know if you want to reiterate that or if it was answered through the end of the presentation.
Thanks, Max. Yeah, my question is more about the rate. I think it's excellent body of data, and my applause goes out to all you who endeavored into the study. Is great standpoint, great foundation. But my question was more about the rate of boats. Like in the example at the Nelson Spring Creek site, you saw a number of boats. I was wondering if you gathered any information about rate, which would be interesting for you know, from the perspective of a white-tailed deer down on the bank at sea over a given time. Just a thought.
Pat, we do have the ability to, as Jeff said, it was Jeff and I parsing out individual days and going through thousands of images, but you can literally put a time clock on that and get a rate. We counted drift boats and rafts differently. Is that important? Maybe not really. Obviously the fishing versus other activities. So these are the sorts of things we're going to fine tune. That data is still all there. If anybody has insomnia, wants to, instead of counting sheep, wants to count boats going down the river, we can provide that opportunity. So a lot of it, Pat, gets down to what sort of information would be useful. So if we take this summary data we have here and now make the data consistent, say from Father's Day, that we have at least sweep counts on both weekends and at least 2 weekdays for every week of the season. And we have 7 to 10 cameras recording who's going by doing what. And again, I can't emphasize enough, we have absolutely no interest in who it is. We're just interested in how many and what they're doing, except for the birds. We like the birds. We have that data. So as people have a particular interest, but knowing the word Madison does not come up in this conversation, but obviously the Madison was very concerned about commercial use. We want to be able to work with the commercial users to quantify, make sure we're counting them, but everything points on the Yellowstone right now that commercial use is a relatively small, insignificant part during the height of the season. We were not out there in June when most of the use probably is fishing. So this coming season, we'll have that kind of data.
And Pat, to answer your question, the only viewpoint that we put out there on time of use across the day is on the website. So I just posted that on there, and that's that. I just basically took a time lapse of video, and so you can play one day within 2 minutes, in front of your screen, and you get that sense of people, when people start showing up, kind of dribbles through, then it peaks, then it dribbles down, and down to the end of the day. And it gets pretty predictable after you go through these photos. So that's the most we did. And yes, eventually you would want timestamp on each of the counts, and then you would graph that accordingly at a day time frame and sum that up.
Great. Okay, we have another question came in from Sabina asking, do we know where river users are coming from? Are they local, Park County, or from Montana or out of state?
So the ITRR study did ascertain where those users are from. and they were largely from Park County, and then that horrible county to the west called Gallatin County, I think, and then out of staters. I intentionally did not count license plates in the fish access sites because I think it is a little bit of a flashpoint. I also might point out that our sweep data this year will be high, as people who were meeting guides and all, they were asked to drive themselves. So we probably saw maybe 10 to 15% more vehicles in some of these places that we would expect to see if they weren't being asked to travel by themselves. So no, we don't. It is information that could easily be used, but it could also be information that could be highly inflammatory. So at least this time around, we did not ascertain that. But the ITRR interview data does have that.
Good question, though.
Another question from Kimball here. Is the data and quality similar to the data upon which the FWP based its Madison River decision?
No comment.
This is a very good question. I would say a great deal of attention was paid to how our survey was constructed based on some of the experience of the Madison. I have a background in survey work, and I would say that some of the questions that were asked in the Madison surveys were highly biased towards non-residents, guided use, and what constitutes crowding. We intentionally stayed away from that. Not for any other reason that we didn't want to lead the witness. The issues on the Madison were well calcified by the time those surveys were done, so they were looking for particular information. In this case, we intentionally wanted to look at baseline information on use, level of use, and where. And so the survey that was constructed, and if we don't have the survey vehicle up online, we can put it up there, was intentionally based by conversations with ITRR, FWP, and others to stay away from of using the word crowding. If they thought it was crowded, they brought it up. We didn't lead them to, do you think it's crowded or not crowded? That was some of the, I shared some of the, and this is not meant as any criticism of FWP, but I shared the instruments used on Madison with two colleagues that I used to work with in the survey world, and they both found them to be highly biased in that it was clearly looking for a particular response.
That said, our goal is not to be right. And we work with FWP and the local biologists and are talking with them on, how we can make ours better for their concerns, and also how it might influence the state, because this is not just an issue for the Madison and the Yellowstone. So it's a very collaborative, it's at times heated. It's heated for the right reasons.
I like the question, Max. Was there anything that surprised either of you in the data? And I think the surprise for me, and beyond the fact that we really didn't know what the hell we were doing when we started, and you could argue we still don't, was just how much fun and enjoyable people find their Yellowstone experience. Two, when you start plotting against weather and type of use and the like, how that data starts to really come together. So we really do have a chance to do a heat map of the Yellowstone. And it's clear that once people are on the water, generally there is a lot of water there. We have certain choke points. They're called fish access sites. They're actually only probably less than 5 or so where vehicles and people and short ramps and tight turnarounds and all that come together, where, you know, it starts to get a little hairy. Again, I was very impressed by how well people got along with each other. And so I think the surprise for me was just how much, you know, level of use, variety of use, and how well we kind of were able to start trying to interact with people. And beyond that, I have to give kudos to PCEC and the private landowners and all. There's such a willingness to really work with this. The guiding community, everybody has been just so supportive of this. That makes it a hell of a lot easier to move forward. Right now, this community is all behind this.
Yeah, I'd add to that, and Becca left a comment along these lines. Is when I was out there doing this work, and people would see me with a clipboard or something, and just always out of curiosity ask what I was doing, and I'd explain it. Everyone was really happy that we were doing this work. People who were coming off the river, getting on it, were you know, expressed gratitude that we were looking at this and we're gathering the data. Because everyone notices, you know, has noticed, you know, the increase in use. And so that was something that kind of surprised me too. I thought I'd expect some people to kind of get upset with, you know, us poking our noses into this, but most everyone was, you know, just about everyone I talked to was very happy about it.
I'd also like to make sure that people take, you know, by emailing me or yelling at Jeff or sharing with Max. But as you guys have used different fish access sites, you know, another picnic table, one that's not underneath the cottonwoods, so every single mosquito finds me, how your turnaround experience is, signage, you know, all those things that might make your experience, or because your experience, how would make a novice experience better. Those are really valuable for us, so we can start really honing in on what do we do with all this data.
Yeah, Whit and Jeff, and I guess this is Dan Vermillion. I would just say that based on what, you know, my involvement in the Madison process for a lot of years, I think one of the things that FWP ran into initially is reaching conclusions on their data before they had enough data to probably have those conclusions stand up to a lot of criticism or at least scrutiny from the public. And the data that always stuck with me is that, you know, the initial data came out saying that potentially 18% of the use on the Madison was commercial and the rest of it was non-commercial. And a lot of that had to do is, if you said, look at the data over the course of the year versus just look at the data between June 15th and say July 15th. And so there were certain periods of crowding where sometimes that data wasn't quite as reflective of what was going on that particular day, but when looked at from an annual perspective, it was. So I think you're really smart not to be reaching conclusions like this and put this data out there and really address those early and get a lot of data before you start coming up with significant conclusions.
And Dan, I just add to that, especially this coming year when we have a solid data set, that data set will be available. The data itself will be available. We might draw conclusions from it, but the actual data, the full set, will always be available to the community. And so different inferences can be done. This is not meant to just go into a report that goes immediately to final draft and you get presented with it.
Well, I'm just going to jump in, being mindful of time. We're nearing the 1 o'clock hour. I understand if people have other commitments that they need to go to and are going to drop off the call, but Jeff and Whitney and myself and others are more than happy to stay on and answer more questions and continue this discussion. So if you have the time and would like to participate some more, please feel free to. We have that flexibility. So I just want to let that be known. And then Michelle was just saying, you know, if people are interested in participating, you know, if we could always use an extra hand, we can always use some help from being out there on the river, doing some of the field work, to even down the road to processing imagery and data. So one great way to do that would, if you're interested, is come to Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group meetings. They're every other month now. The first Thursday of the month, they're being held virtually via Zoom for the time being. That's a good way to kind of stay in the loop. And then, always feel free to reach out to me at PCEC, and I will try to keep you up to date.
Max, I see Gavin's got a question that
yeah.
I think is a really good one. Certainly one near and dear to those of us who want to see this continue.
Yeah, so I'll read out his question. And what are the biggest limiting factors that would prevent the study from continuing in the future? People, volunteers, funding, etc. That is a great question. All of the above?
No, I think the good news is I think we have developed enough experience with this that I think coming out of 2021, especially if we can standardize the camera use and get a little bit of machine learning, that we'll have a really good sense of use baseline. And I think done very economically. Because it's been driven by the community, I think the important thing will be to take what we've learned in these 2 years and get it into a format that everybody feels they were part of and agrees with. And then it really, so we have a lift of needing to raise some money for this coming season for equipment, interns, and gas money, really, and then whatever analysis. But going forward, I think the important thing will be for the community to calendar repeating this kind of survey on an ongoing basis, not every year, but say every 3 years, and having PCEC and others drive a conversation on what's that mean. So I appreciate the question because it's the right one to ask. Keeping these things up and running is always the most difficult. I think, this is not a million dollar type projects. We basically spent about $16,000 to give you the data you see now. And I would anticipate next year with the extended season being just a little bit more, Jeff and I and others need to start putting that pencil down. But it's, I would say, arguably a pretty damn good return on our buck. And it's largely because there are so many volunteers really helping with this.
Okay, I'm going to jump back to a question Wendy had. Do we have any examples from rivers that are being well managed from a use perspective?
So, that's really relative. I think that's such, thanks, Wendy. This would take 20 beers and a drunken fest at Chico to solve, but we're looking at multiples, and lots of people within the Watershed group bring different groups to bear, whether it's the Snake or other places in Montana. I would really like to emphasize that while there are good examples elsewhere, this is really about getting the community together. Those questions at the beginning are tough questions, and they're values-based questions. And all you have to do is go on Facebook and see the amount of emotion that goes into this particular topic. And so while there are, I think, other examples, the United States, and especially Montana, has zero carrying capacity research on rivers, right? They don't. There are bag limits on fishing, but the catch and release industry has kind of changed that dynamic. Whereas hunting, there are carrying capacity limits, maybe not on how many people can go out and shoot at one another, but guns somewhat limit your willingness to go out with 10,000 people. So I think, while we're looking at other places, the one thing I've learned from the other places that I would say, at least from my personal biases, are being managed well, is that there is strong community dialogue. and healthy people sitting down at the table and talking through very tough questions and respecting one another's opinions. And that's what we're trying to do. Is I would say that's, to follow on Gavin's question, that is the biggest risk to this succeeding. I think we're going to be able to collect more data. Data doesn't necessarily solve values problems. We'll get through the next couple of years and get better and better at this and maybe be a model for the entire nation. But the community dialogue and what it requires to get people in a bar together and work through these things, it's a tough one. And to Whitney's point earlier, that's what I'm thankful for organizations like PCEC to help with that dialogue. Sorry for my sermon, but that's just as a local who lives on
Well,
the
I
river.
think the other part of that question or that conversation, Jeff, is that historically Montana, what we've regulated has been fishermen and hunters, right? And for years, I mean, up until very recently, we haven't really had to think about non-commercial or non-consumptive use on our rivers. And if you look at what's growing on our rivers and our communities, that's where the growth is. And that's where it's going to be really tricky to figure out how to get people who may not feel like they're part of the crowding problem to be part of the solution. And we'll be willing to reach some sort of compromises as to unlimited use for everyone all the time. And it's going to be a tough conversation. It'll happen with deer hunting, it'll happen with elk hunting, but you know, when you go from 1 million people to 2 million people with the same amount of resource, it requires more sharing.
Yeah, the tragedy of the commons. I mean, you nailed it. Can you really solve for that unless you move to an English model of the gentry own the rivers?
Right,
I think there was another.
right along, Jeff.
It would,
Max, there's a question about going downstream from Livingston towards Reed Point. We do hope to deploy this methodology to at least say 2 beats down below. Whether or not we'll get all the way to Reed Point. But again, that's where the fishing community guides and all would be very helpful as to where would be good vantage points. We would approach the private landowners. We had no problems with these cameras, largely because no one knew they were there. Obviously, if someone knew they were there, 99% of the people would leave them alone. So anyway, we've heard the interest of moving the study down river, and we hope to incorporate at least additional stretches.
Yeah, I agree. I think it would, you know, as we get better at this, we can definitely expand, and we all know that, you know, heavy use in the valley displaces people to the east. And, you know, that used to be kind of the local secret of much emptier stretch of river, and that cat is out of the bag now, and there are a lot of people floating downstream from Livingston. So yeah, it'd be very beneficial to expand in that direction too. And another question here from Barbara. Any chance to overlay local climate data with our data to notice perhaps how annual snowpack levels, peak flows, turbidity, and water temperatures influence usage?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All the sweep data did note kind of the weather conditions. Obviously the water temperatures are recorded. We don't necessarily know the turbidity. The snowpack and flows are recorded or matter of record. The one thing, and maybe someone knows this, the one thing I couldn't automatically find, although I think if it is recorded for maybe a month or two, but we need to really capture daily temperature and weather over the time of our study, just because that kind of overlay. But yeah, we can bring in all sorts of you know, different tabulations with this data. So it's really depends on what people are interested in.
and time and money. But yeah, we did capture, to answer the question, we captured the 2 most important, temperature and turbidity, and that's in the data.
Hey, the one other piece of data that might be pretty cheap to get a hold of and be probably fairly indicative as to where guides usually move is if you look at spikes in the Lamar or the Gardner after a thunderstorm in the park, then you'll start seeing a lot of movement where the guides and outfitters will go downriver just because that's clearer water and they'll move in relation to where that plug of mud is.
So yeah, again, that would be turbidity, right, Dan? I mean, I get your point. It only takes, it's what, 2.5 hours for the plug to go from Lamar to basically Gardner. But yeah, I mean, maybe I'm missing something there though.
Well, all I'm thinking, I mean, I think it's a little more than that, but if you're trying to figure out how groups move around, I mean, the commercial guys in particular, and the fishermen that are really paying attention to water turbidity, they just get on that USGS site and you see where the plug is and you can kind of figure around. I usually figure 24 hours from the plug to big timber, give or take.
Yeah. And your point is like, yeah, you got a day before things, change dynamically too, right?
Yep, for sure.
I'd be interested to your point in what other river systems do people move to and then move back, right? I think we almost have more of an impact on the Madison and the Missouri due to
Yeah, and I think that's true because in 2016 when we had the fish kill, everybody suddenly activated their Madison permits and started fishing over there. It's a long drive, but it's better than not working. So I'd say now that the Madison's a little bit more structured and more permitted, and it's not as easy to get your permit activated, I think that mobility will be less so. And the Boulder, the Stillwater, they get some work, they get some use, but not a ton. Most people just keep going downriver.
Yeah.
Might point out our cameras do capture. Go ahead. The
I was
cameras
just going to say,
capture.
Whitney talked about capturing hatches too. Like you have a big hatch, you're going to have, preponderance of different types of vessels. Go ahead, Whitney.
No, I was just pointing out the cameras. So one of the days we did a sweep survey was a day where that plug was coming through the Paradise, and you could by the time when I started the sweep, it was clear upriver, and then you ran into it halfway down the valley. And the cameras do record, they can see the water, when this muddy water comes through. So I might also again emphasize that, for instance, most of you know that Carbella has had a major makeover on how it will be used. It's gone, when it was closed this fall, it's going to reopen as a limited camping site with a host. And commercial use permits will now be enforced. They've always been required, but they never care about. So those are the sorts of things that BLM pretty much did that unilaterally because they're over in Butte and don't have a lot of, in fact, the Forest Service really does most of the oversight on Carbella. So, but those are the sorts of things that, how you use the river and where you use the river and what you'd like to see with the river are all things that we want to capture.
Great. Well, any last questions from anyone out there who's still on the line?
I'm not sure we addressed Dan's question about, so we don't have plans to go down to Reed Point, just to be clear. We kind of drop off at Springdale at the furthest and really Livingston. But, that's back to Gavin's point, time and money, we can expand. We did not track really people who are camping, just so you know, even though many of us know that there's a lot of camping that goes on the river, especially on the islands legally, right? So we didn't do that, but thanks for pointing that out, and we'll factor that in maybe surveys or some other way to try to get that dynamic.
Yeah, definitely. Overnight use is something I heard a lot about this year. And so we'll need to generate more awareness about that, especially with the waste stream that generates.
Yeah, and just in terms of crowding, I mean, oftentimes these groups are now 6 to 12 big family groups, which is great that people are getting out and using it. But when they converge on a takeout, man, I mean, that's where you see a lot of the gum ups in Springdale and Gray Bear in particular aren't really set up well for handling those large influxes of cars and boats at one time.
Yeah, and we only have 2 wardens. I mean, that's what a lot of people don't realize is how overtapped they are to actually enforce the laws that exist. Let's not even talk about the laws that don't exist or the ethics. So we really want to work with the wardens and help them out, right? It's not about blame, but yeah, there is how do you fund an ethic issue? But thanks for pointing that out, Dan. Anything else? Hopefully you see the URL. You can go there. There's an email on there. You can download the ITRR data. You can download our raw data. You might not really want to, but you can look at it. And we're totally open, like Whitney said, like pepper us. Like we're not trying to be right. We're just trying to get the methodology better. So let us know, email us, and we'll try to factor it into how we design for the future.
Yeah, we just added that link again to the chat box. And one last question popped up talking about how the data is not intended to drive regulation. But can we speak to the value of the data from a community perspective and why it matters? And I think, the desire to do this came from the community, recognizing that there's issues with increased use and pressures. And I think initially the value of this will be able to demonstrate to the community that the uses are changing, the numbers are changing, it's increasing. And perhaps it could help guide individuals' decisions about how and when and where they'll use the river, and maybe not necessarily just to spread the problem out, but to show the interest that we all have in it, and then potentially the data will be there for when and if a major problem does arise. And so that will benefit the community the most, in that we won't be scrambling to catch up and figure out what the source of that conflict might be. We'll have the information at hand so that we can look at this and it's, as Whitney said, it's all open, it's available for anyone to look at and to analyze. And the main benefit I hope to see that this data will provide would be a minimization of any potential user conflicts, and that we don't end up where the Madison found itself in the last few years.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Max, that obviously we've bent over backwards making this transparent, so that hopefully when the data is presented, it's trusted, it's known where it came from, it's not just coming out of the ether. And as Dan pointed out with his bruises from being a commissioner, if you start early enough and this data is at the table, then the conversation should be different than if everybody's bringing their own perceptions and their own little snippets of data. So that's really our hope. And there'll probably be some aha moments like, well, it's really not that the river is getting an overuse, but certain times, certain places, certain types of use, we now will have data that can help point to that. We don't know until we get it.
Yes. Well, I think this is a good time to wrap it up. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and Jeff and Whitney for presenting, and all the great questions that people asked and some great insight. And we hope to continue this dialogue further. We'll be doing so at the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group meetings, and I'll be sure to send out any notice I have if this presentation is going to be given again, if you want to participate again in the future. So any parting thoughts from Jeff or Whitney?
Just thank you.
More than enough for me.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone. We're going to turn it off now and we'll get back to it.